The wind howled against the tall windows of Wexford Manor as the last guests departed the ballroom, leaving the polished marble floor streaked with the fading light of chandeliers. A chill crept along the corridors, winding itself between the portraits of ancestors who had long since demanded propriety above all else. In the grand hall, the echoes of laughter and whispered gossip lingered like smoke, twisting through the air, heavy with judgment. Somewhere beyond the heavy velvet drapes, the garden slept under a mantle of moonlight, silvered and silent, yet not forgiving. It was in that stillness, in the space between the retreat of society and the solitude of private chambers, that she found herself, her skirts torn from haste, her hair disheveled, and her pulse hammering like the hooves of a runaway carriage. The young woman had arrived at the manor with hope in her heart, a hope fragile as the porcelain of a teacup, only to have it shattered the instant she had stumbled into circumstance and into scandal. Her name was unspoken by the proper lips around town. Those who did speak it spoke it with a tremor of incredulity, as if daring to pronounce it might summon misfortune. And now, here she stood, trembling in the shadowed hall, uncertain whether to flee or to collapse beneath the weight of eyes that had not yet found her, though they surely would. The Duke, tall and immovable as one of the ancestral portraits lining the walls, entered from the library adjoining the hall. His coat, still dark from the night air, rustled as he moved, his gaze sharp yet measured. Few in society could claim to match him in both appearance and reputation. His hair, dark and meticulously arranged, caught the flickering candlelight, casting shadows across his face that seemed carved rather than lived. And yet, for all his composure, a faint flicker of surprise crossed his features as he saw her, herself no more than a breath from fainting, her cheek pressed against the polished oak of a table. She had been found, after all, in a most compromising position, wrapped not in modest gowns but in the unintended intimacy of a discarded scarf, trembling beneath his very roof. "Madam," he said, voice low, measured, yet betraying a tremor of something closer to disbelief than propriety. "You must rise at once." Her gaze lifted, wide and fearful, her lips parted but silent. She could barely meet his eyes, not from lack of courage but from the suffocating knowledge of how the world would perceive her. A breath caught in her throat, and she willed herself to speak, to offer some explanation that might pierce the curtain of judgment already settling upon her. Yet no words came. Words were feeble shields against the weight of aristocratic scrutiny. He stepped closer, his boots silent against the marble, and extended a hand that could have been a threat or a lifeline or both. She grasped it with fingers trembling, and for a heartbeat, the world narrowed to nothing more than the warmth of that hand, the steady strength beneath the polished cuff, and the firelight that danced across his eyes. And then a gasp, soft, stifled, escaped her and the spell of stillness shattered. The sound of the front doors swinging closed echoed through the hall, carrying with it the faintest hint of outside spectators, servants who had lingered too long, guests who had strayed too near. Rumors were already gathering, invisible yet palpable, like the scent of ozone before a storm. "He has let her remain in his quarters," whispers would say. "And yet she is not his wife." Such words, floating unseen in the corridors, could wound deeper than any blade. He guided her to a settee, the candles flickering as if in anticipation of the revelation yet to come. She sank onto it, knees drawn together, hands clasped as though to hold herself intact. Her heart raced, caught between dread and some foolish, impossible hope that the Duke's intervention might spare her from ruin. He knelt before her, the movement both deliberate and intimate, as though his own composure demanded control even as curiosity lured him closer. "Pray, you must tell me, how have you come to be found in this state?" His words were polite, yet the weight behind them pressed upon her with the full force of expectation and propriety. Her voice, when it came, was barely a whisper. I sought shelter, my lord, from the storm outside. I had no intention," she faltered, ashamed not merely of the accident but of the implications it carried in the unforgiving eyes of society. He raised a single brow, a gesture precise and silent, inviting no falsehoods. "The storm is a poor excuse for the position in which you were discovered, madam. The world, I fear, is less forgiving than this room, and yet, perhaps we may temper its judgment, if only in this fleeting hour." Her eyes, wide with both fear and something like relief, traced the lines of his face, the strength of jaw, the intelligence of gaze, the faint tremor of compassion beneath the rigor of his social duty. And for the first time that night, she sensed the possibility of agency, fragile though it was, in a world otherwise ruled by whispers and expectation. Minutes passed in tense silence, the only sounds the crackle of candle flames and the occasional groan of settling floorboards. Outside, the wind pressed its cold fingers against the manor walls, as if insisting that the world beyond would not forgive, would not forget. Inside, however, the Duke's attention remained fixed, unyielding yet not unkind. Finally, he rose, offering her a discreet handkerchief and a measure of protection wrapped in the dignity he wielded like a weapon. "We shall consider this night a matter between ourselves," he said, his voice softening just enough to hint at the curiosity now dancing behind his controlled exterior. "But, madam, you must be mindful. The hour is late, the eyes of society keen, and the consequences of indiscretion severe." She nodded, the weight of gratitude and shame pressing upon her equally. She knew the world beyond these walls would care little for nuance, for circumstance, for accident. Yet in his gaze she saw the first flicker of something unspoken, the recognition of her worth, however precarious, and the acknowledgement of her vulnerability. As he left her to the quiet of the drawing room, the hall seemed to exhale, the echoes of whispers growing louder in the corners, ready to follow them both. The seed of scandal had been planted, but so too had the seed of curiosity, an unspoken promise of what might unfold when the eyes of propriety and passion collided in the days to come. And in that fragile, trembling moment she understood the truth of her position, that tonight her reputation lay suspended between ruin and revelation, and that the Duke, mysterious, imposing, yet undeniably human, held the key to both. The candlelight flickered once more, shadows dancing like witnesses on the walls. Outside, the storm continued its relentless song. Inside, a single pair of eyes lingered on the woman in his shirt, the world poised to judge, yet unable in that moment to determine the shape of the bond that had just begun. The night had drawn its first breath, and with it, the wheels of consequence had begun to turn. The morning sun spilled over Wexford Manor in pale gold, touching the dew-laden gardens and painting the marble balustrades in gentle warmth, yet no light could pierce the shadow that had settled upon the young woman's reputation. The night's events, though fleeting in time, had left impressions deeper than the footprints upon the polished floors. Servants whispered in corridors, maids lingered at doorways, and distant cousins visiting from neighboring estates had already caught wind of the incident. The halls of the manor seemed smaller, narrower, as if the very walls had grown in judgment, pressing in upon her with silent accusation. She moved through them with careful steps, skirts held just so, eyes lowered not in deference but in defense of the fragile dignity that remained. The Duke, for his part, maintained the usual exterior of composure and imperviousness. Yet beneath the polished coat and the measured gait, a storm of intrigue stirred. The memory of the young woman, trembling and pale in his private quarters, remained lodged in his mind, insolent and persistent. He had watched her retreat through the halls with a mixture of restraint and fascination, noting how her slender hands clutched the edges of her skirts, how her eyes darted at imagined observers, and how the flush of shame betrayed an honesty no social mask could conceal. The scandal had begun as an accident, a slip of circumstance, yet in the unforgiving court of society, accidents were rarely forgiven, and whispers were relentless. It was mid-morning when the first token arrived, a discreet message folded into fine stationery, sealed with the Duke's insignia. The letter found her in the drawing-room, where she had taken refuge beneath the quiet hum of morning light. She hesitated before breaking the seal, fingers trembling with both curiosity and apprehension. The script within was precise, deliberate, yet contained an intimacy that startled her. "Madam, I trust you have recovered from the night's unforeseen circumstances. You have my assurance that discretion shall prevail, though I find myself compelled to inquire after your welfare, not as a matter of propriety but of personal concern." Her breath caught, her eyes scanning the carefully chosen words. There was no impropriety in them, yet each sentence pulsed with the unmistakable tension of interest, the unspoken acknowledgement that she was, in some measure, more than a subject of rumor. She clutched the letter to her chest, heart hammering, and yet a blush crept across her cheeks at the implication. In the parlance of polite society, it was a simple gesture, a note of inquiry. In the unspoken language of the heart, it was an invitation to dance upon the edge of propriety and curiosity. The day carried on with the usual cadence of Wexford Manor's routine, yet the young woman found herself acutely aware of every glance, every murmur. Guests arriving for luncheon tilted their heads slightly as she passed, a slight narrowing of eyes here, a suppressed cough there, and though no one dared to speak outright, she felt the invisible weight of scrutiny press upon her shoulders. The Duke, meanwhile, remained elegantly aloof in his study, yet the staff noted a certain restlessness in his step, a tendency to linger near the drawing rooms, a slight pause whenever her name was mentioned. Later, in the gardens, she sought refuge among the roses and clipped hedges, the scent of earth and bloom a balm for the nerves that still trembled beneath the veneer of composure. Her reflection caught in the still surface of a fountain revealed the pale shadows under her eyes, the tension in her shoulders, the fragile grace with which she carried herself. And yet, even as she moved among the blooms, she sensed the stirrings of curiosity, the inexorable pull of attention, as a gloved hand appeared at the edge of the path. The Duke stood there, expression carefully neutral, but eyes, those sharp, dark eyes, tracking her with unyielding focus. "Good day, madam," he said, voice low yet carrying across the clipped hedgerows. "I trust you are not so burdened by yesterday's inconvenience as to neglect the beauty of this morning." Her lips parted in surprise and she bowed her head, careful to maintain the boundary of decorum. "Your Grace is kind to inquire. I find the morning gentler than the night." He inclined his head, stepping closer, though the space between them remained charged with restraint. "Gentle, perhaps, yet society is seldom so forgiving. I trust you understand the consequences should these circumstances be misconstrued." She swallowed, her pulse rising, and nodded. I fear I do, my lord." He regarded her with something more than mere concern, the weight of expectation and the flicker of private intrigue entwined in his gaze. "Then let us tread carefully, madam, for the eyes of the world are keen, and rumor sharper still. Yet I confess," he continued, voice softening imperceptibly, "that curiosity, though dangerous, has its own merit." She dared a fleeting glance at him, caught in the tension of his proximity, noting the precise control in his posture, the subtle tension in his hands, the unspoken invitation wrapped in propriety. For a moment, the gardens and the gossip and the pressing judgments faded, leaving only the charged quiet between them, where danger and desire hung delicately in balance. The day's stillness, however, was fragile. By evening, the first tendrils of rumor began to manifest beyond the manor's walls. A passing carriage, a visiting cousin, a maid's inadvertent disclosure, all were enough to ignite the tinder of society's imagination. Whispers reached the drawing rooms, threaded through polite conversation like poisoned silk. "Did you hear about the Duke's guest last night? Quite improper, I hear. He permitted her presence in his private quarters. It would be scandalous were it true." The young woman moved among the conversations with cautious grace, aware of every word, every glance, yet determined not to reveal the full measure of her anxiety. Every curtsy, every careful smile was a shield, and yet it was impossible to mask the stirrings within. The fluttering heartbeat of fear mingled with the sharper edge of curiosity she felt toward the man whose discretion had saved her from immediate ruin. At supper, the Duke's gaze found her across the long mahogany table, steady and deliberate, unyielding yet not unkind. There was a subtle acknowledgment in the slight tilt of his head, the briefest incline of his brow, the faintest curve of a lip. In the parlance of the manor, these were gestures of decorum, meaningless to the casual observer. To her, they were messages unspoken yet undeniable. A flower left upon her plate, a single pale rose, spoke more eloquently than any whispered word, its petals brushing against her fingertips like a secret. And so the scandal took root, tendrils curling through the corridors, wrapping the manor in quiet suspense. Yet within that same web, the unspoken connection between them began to crystallize, fragile as frost upon the morning grass, delicate as the silver threads of candlelight that would soon illuminate their private moments. Each glance, each gesture, each token, however subtle, built a bridge across the chasm of propriety and expectation, daring them both to acknowledge the curiosity and the desire that society would condemn. The night closed with a storm of quiet tension. Candles flickered against the painted ceilings, the wind whispered through the eaves, and the young woman retired to her chamber with a heart unsettled yet alive, the rose pressed against her palm, a reminder of the Duke's watchful, enigmatic presence. Outside, the stars glimmered with indifference. Inside, the threads of scandal and desire had woven a tapestry that neither could ignore. The world of Wexford Manor, for all its grandeur, had become a stage for delicate intrigue, and the first act of their entangled fates was only just concluding. And in the hushed quiet, with the candlelight flickering across her reflection in the glass, she understood that society's judgment was relentless, yet the pull of that dark, magnetic presence, of the Duke, was impossible to resist. The tokens had arrived, the whispers had begun, and the stage was set for revelations yet to come. The night was long, the consequences pressing, yet beneath the weight of scandal, a fragile, irresistible spark had been ignited. The library at Wexford Manor exuded a solemnity that neither storm nor scandal could disturb. Its walls, lined with leather-bound tomes and gilt-edged volumes, seemed to absorb the weight of centuries, each spine a silent witness to whispered confessions, clandestine affairs, and the steady passage of time. Candles flickered in their sconces, casting a golden haze that softened the severity of the Duke's features and lent warmth to the otherwise austere room. Outside, the wind rattled the shutters, carrying the faint scent of rain-soaked earth from the gardens below, yet within these walls the world seemed contained, ordered, and yet charged with unspoken potential. She entered hesitantly, her skirts brushing the polished floor, the rose from the previous evening tucked carefully into her bodice. Her heart still fluttered from the weight of societal whispers, each step echoing the apprehension she felt in the marrow of her bones. Yet something in the quiet dignity of the library, the soft scent of old pages mingled with candle wax, gave her courage. She knew the Duke would be there, as he always was in moments of contemplation and measured reflection, and she also knew that here, within these walls, the world's judgment could not intrude. He looked up as she approached, eyes dark and deliberate, a shadow of surprise flitting across his features before the mask of composure returned. The day's tension hung in the air between them, taut and electric. He gestured toward a chair near the hearth, the firelight dancing across the dark marble mantel, warming the room with a subtle glow. "Pray be seated," he said, voice calm yet carrying the weight of expectation. "This, I trust, will be a private conversation, unmarred by the gossip that waits beyond these doors." She lowered herself into the chair, hands clasped in her lap, and inhaled deeply, the scent of parchment and flame grounding her. "I am grateful for your discretion, my lord," she murmured, eyes flicking to the fire before meeting his gaze. "And yet I fear my presence here has caused enough disturbance already." He inclined his head, the shadowed corners of his mouth lifting just so. "Disturbance perhaps, though truth is seldom so simple. I have watched you navigate these halls with the grace of one unaccustomed to the scrutiny of society, yet unwilling to let it diminish her dignity. Tell me, madam, what is it that weighs so heavily upon you?" Her throat constricted, and for a moment words seemed impossible. She had rehearsed a dozen explanations, each one faltering beneath the gravity of his attention, the intensity of those dark eyes that sought her understanding as much as they demanded honesty. And then, with a courage born of desperation, she spoke, her voice low but steady. "I am not as the world believes me. My station is uncertain, my past complicated. I have lived my life in quiet obscurity, striving for dignity where opportunity has been scarce. Yet here in this house, under your gaze, I am made acutely aware of how fragile propriety can be, and how perilous a single misstep may become." The Duke listened, silent, every movement precise, as though absorbing not just her words but the tremor of truth beneath them. The firelight flickered across his sharp features, and in that shifting glow, she glimpsed the first trace of vulnerability in him, not weakness, but the quiet opening of a man accustomed to control yet confronted with a force he could not command. "You speak with candor," he observed, voice measured. "And yet there is something more, something left unsaid. I perceive it in the careful restraint of your posture, the subtle hesitation of your eyes. Speak freely, madam. Here, the world need not understand, and perhaps it shall not matter." She drew a shaky breath and let the words spill, the dam of secrecy finally giving way. "I have known hardship," she confessed, eyes glimmering with unshed tears. "I have been judged, whispered about, denied the respect I sought, and yet I have endeavored to maintain grace. And yet, my lord, I find myself drawn to you, not as the subject of scandal, not as a creature to be pitied, but as one compelled by admiration and something deeper, something forbidden yet undeniable." He remained still, absorbing her confession with a weight that seemed to anchor the very air. For a heartbeat, silence reigned, broken only by the crackle of the fire and the distant patter of rain against the windows. Then, slowly, deliberately, he crossed the room, placing himself near the hearth, where the golden light softened the severity of his presence. "And you believe," he said, his voice a low resonance that carried more than mere words, "that such honesty, though perilous, could survive the scrutiny of the world?" She met his gaze, unwavering despite the tremor in her heart. "I do not know if it can survive. I only know that to remain silent would be to betray the truth of my feelings, and the truth of who I am when I am in your presence." He considered her words, the silence heavy and deliberate. Then, with a slow and purposeful motion, he extended his hand, not as a gesture of propriety alone, but as a bridge across the chasm that had grown between them. "Then you shall not remain silent, nor shall you bear this burden alone. Confession is a risk, yes, but perhaps it is also a liberation. Speak, madam, and know that what you reveal will be met not with judgment, but with understanding." The tremor in her hands lessened, and she took his offered hand, finding in it a warmth that belied the rigid formality of his manner. The firelight reflected in their joined hands, casting elongated shadows upon the walls, shadows that seemed to dance with the possibilities of revelation and the unspoken promise of mutual recognition. She felt, in that connection, a fragile hope, that perhaps for the first time she was seen not merely as a subject of circumstance but as a person of complexity and depth, deserving of attention and respect. Minutes stretched into hours, though the world outside continued its indifferent turning. She spoke of her past, of the small victories and the persistent fears, of the moments that had defined her in ways unseen by polite society. He, in turn, revealed fragments of himself, responsibilities inherited, expectations imposed, and the quiet loneliness that had accompanied authority and wealth. Their words interwove, a tapestry of vulnerability and trust, each confession a delicate step toward intimacy, each revelation a thread binding them together. At last she leaned back, breath heavy yet steadied, and looked upon him with a mixture of relief and uncertainty. "I had feared that such honesty would invite scorn or worse, indifference." He shook his head, a rare softness in his gaze. "Indifference is reserved for those who lack courage. You have shown courage in abundance, and for that, I hold you in regard unlike any other. This knowledge, once spoken, alters the landscape between us, yet it does not diminish your dignity. Nor mine, I find, for I am compelled as much by your forthrightness as I am wary of the consequences it may bring." She felt the first true flutter of hope, a delicate thing, fragile yet exhilarating. The storm of gossip, the threat of ruin, all remained, but within this private chamber, a sanctuary had been carved by confession, by trust, and by the fragile acknowledgement of desire tempered by propriety. And yet, as the candles guttered and the wind pressed against the windows, both understood that revelation was only a beginning, not a conclusion. The world beyond these walls remained unforgiving, and the path forward would demand courage, restraint, and the willingness to confront consequences that neither could fully predict. In the quiet aftermath, their hands still lightly touching, a wordless understanding passed between them. They had crossed a threshold from which there was no return, and in doing so, they had forged a connection both perilous and profound, delicate as the flickering candlelight yet undeniable as the pulse of life itself. The library, with its ancient tomes and flickering flames, had become a crucible for truth and trust, a turning point upon which the next act of their intertwined fates would hinge. Outside, rain fell in gentle insistence, yet within, a tentative peace had settled, a peace forged in confession, tempered by understanding, and carrying within it the spark of something that might yet bloom into the impossible. The night awaited, full of possibilities and perils, yet for now they remained, two souls revealed, two hearts daring to acknowledge a bond neither scandal nor society could erase. The evening air hung thick with the scent of rain-soaked earth and candle smoke, carrying a weight of anticipation that pressed against the high ceilings of Wexford Manor. The grand ballroom, emptied of guests and draped in the hush of shadows, seemed a different world from the glittering hubbub of polite society. The chandeliers, their crystals dulled by the retreating storm, refracted the soft flicker of firelight along the polished floors, casting fractured reflections that trembled like restless spirits. Every step echoed, deliberate, measured, each sound magnifying the tension that had built over days of whispered rumors and stolen glances. She entered first, her gown dark as midnight, yet catching the glint of firelight in the delicate embroidery that traced her bodice. Her eyes, wide and unguarded, scanned the vast room, aware of how each shadow could become a witness, how each silence might carry judgment. But there was also determination there, a steel-threaded courage that had grown from nights spent under scrutiny, from hours of whispered speculation and careful maneuvering among the watchful eyes of society. She did not falter. She had rehearsed this moment countless times in the quiet of her chamber, each imagined gesture a rehearsal for courage she now embodied. He stood at the center of the room, the last echoes of propriety's restraint still clinging to his posture, yet betraying the faint tremor of desire that pulsed beneath his polished exterior. The storm outside had subsided, leaving a clean, sharp scent of rain that clung to the drapes and the polished floorboards, and it seemed to him that the world itself had been cleared of distraction so that only they remained. His gaze, dark and unyielding, followed her approach, measuring each step, noting the way her hand lightly brushed against the folds of her skirt, the quiet poise in her carriage, the defiance hidden in the curve of her jaw. "Good evening," he said, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade tempered in fire. You have come, despite the world's whispering tongues. She lifted her chin, meeting his eyes, the flicker of firelight catching in the dark pools of her gaze. I have come, my lord, she replied, her voice steady, carrying just enough defiance to match the weight of her trepidation. For if this is to be judged, let it be judged with truth and not merely with rumor. The duke's lips curved ever so slightly, not a smile but an acknowledgement of her courage. He took a deliberate step toward her, closing the space between propriety and confession, and in that measured movement, the tension of days, the weight of whispered judgments, seemed to condense into a single taut moment. Then let the truth be spoken, madam, and know that I am neither blind to circumstance nor deaf to desire. We stand at a precipice, you and I, where rumor may bite, where society may scorn, yet we are not compelled to surrender ourselves to it. Her pulse quickened, the words stirring something deep within her, a sense of liberation tempered by fear. And if we are judged? She asked, her voice soft but resolute, carrying the full weight of vulnerability. If the world sees not our intentions but the shadows of accident and scandal? He inclined his head slowly, eyes never leaving hers, every gesture deliberate, every movement speaking the language of control mingled with raw intensity. Then let them judge. My concern lies not in their opinion but in the truth of my regard. You have, in honesty and fortitude, revealed yourself to me, and I cannot deny the gravity of the connection it has forged. The words struck her like a revelation, yet the intensity of his gaze held a danger as sharp as any blade. She felt the unspoken acknowledgement of desire, of admiration, of something forbidden yet irresistible, coursing through the room between them. She drew in a breath, steadying herself, knowing that the next moments would define not only their fates but the fragile equilibrium between propriety and passion. Then speak plainly, my lord, she whispered, stepping closer, the firelight catching the glimmer in her eyes. Reveal what it is that binds us, if it is not merely circumstance, if it is not merely scandal. He paused, as though weighing each word against the ledger of expectation and the ledger of his own heart. I confess, he said finally, voice low, deliberate, carrying the weight of all the restraint he had held these past days, that from the moment of that night, when circumstance brought you beneath my roof and into my presence, I have been unsettled. Not by impropriety, nor by obligation, but by the inescapable gravity of your character, your courage, and the undeniable spark that has ignited despite every prudent warning against indulgence. Her breath caught, a tremor of relief and exhilaration coursing through her. She had feared his judgment, yet now, hearing the confession of his own struggle, she understood the depth of the bond that had quietly grown between them. The air between them shimmered with tension, heavy with the anticipation of revelation, and she stepped closer still, bridging the final measure of distance that had kept their hearts tethered by propriety. Then it is not merely I who stands at the mercy of circumstance, she said, voice steady yet suffused with emotion. We are entwined, my lord, and though the world may scorn, though whispers may follow, our hearts have spoken where society dares not listen. He reached for her hand, lifting it with a delicacy that belied the intensity of his desire, pressing it to his chest where the steady beat of his heart could be felt through the fine fabric of his coat. Yes, he murmured, his lips brushing the air between them rather than her skin. We are entwined, and no force beyond these walls shall dictate the truth of that union. If society would see scandal, let it. I shall not retreat from what I feel, nor shall I abandon the courage it has demanded of you to speak as you have. She felt the heat of his gaze, the strength behind his words, and the fragile, exhilarating surge of hope that had been nurtured through days of tension and quiet longing. The firelight reflected in her eyes, and for a moment the world fell away, leaving only the two of them, bound by honesty, desire, and the perilous thrill of shared confession. The storm that had raged outside in whispers and in rain was now mirrored within, a tempest of emotion tempered by restraint. He drew her closer, not in reckless abandon but in deliberate, precise intimacy, and for the first time she felt the full measure of his regard, unmediated by scandal or expectation. Every unspoken word, every glance, every tremor of hand and breath converged in that moment of declaration, crystallizing the truth that had been forming in silence. Then let us step beyond the judgment of others, he said, voice low but unyielding, and acknowledge the bond forged not by circumstance alone, but by the courage to speak, the courage to listen, and the courage to act upon the truth we now share. Her lips curved in a fleeting, fragile smile, tears welling but restrained as she placed her hand upon his, a gesture equal parts surrender and assertion. Yes, my lord, she whispered, let us do that, for whatever storms may come, we have this truth and it shall guide us. The candles guttered, the fire crackled, and in the flickering glow they stood, two souls no longer bound solely by circumstance, but by confession, understanding, and the exhilarating peril of love openly acknowledged. The world beyond the windows might rage, might whisper, might condemn, yet within that vast, empty ballroom, the tempest had found its resolution, and the heart of scandal had become the heart of intimacy. And in that quiet triumph, both understood that the trials ahead would be met together, that desire and duty, scandal and sincerity, had converged in a declaration neither could deny. The room, the shadows, the firelight, all bore witness to the culmination of tension, to the resolution of long-held restraint, and to the exhilarating promise that what had begun in fear and rumor might yet flourish in trust and truth. The night, heavy with past scandal and the scent of rain, had ended, yet in its wake lay a new dawn of possibility, a path forward forged by courage, honesty, and the declaration of hearts long constrained. The dawn broke slowly over Wexford Manor, spilling pale light across the dewy gardens and the frost-silvered balustrades. The storm of the previous night had passed, leaving the world washed clean, yet the weight of what had transpired lingered in every corridor, every shadowed corner of the estate. The air was crisp and sharp, carrying the faint scent of wet earth and roses, a reminder that even the most violent tempest yielded to calm. Within the manor, however, tension still thrummed like a living thing, an invisible current connecting the two figures who had weathered scandal, confession, and desire in equal measure. She descended the main staircase with careful grace, each step deliberate, her gown flowing like ink against the pale marble. In her hand she carried a small bouquet of wildflowers she had plucked from the garden in the early light, petals still damp with dew, a fragile symbol of life and renewal. Her pulse raced, not with fear alone, but with the anticipation of what was to come, a reckoning not imposed by society but chosen by their own hearts. At the foot of the staircase he waited. The Duke's figure was steady and commanding, framed by the tall arch of the entryway, yet there was a tension in the set of his shoulders, a tightness in the line of his jaw that belied the controlled exterior he had maintained so resolutely for days. His eyes, dark and unwavering, followed her every movement, noting the delicate rise and fall of her chest, the way her hair caught the light, and the subtle tremor in her fingers as she held the bouquet. In that moment he was both observer and participant, caught in the anticipation of acknowledgment that could neither be postponed nor denied. "Good morning," he said, voice low, deliberate, carrying both warmth and command. "You have braved the world's judgment already, and yet you stand here, unbowed, unbroken. I am honored and perhaps unprepared for the courage you have shown." Her lips curved in a faint, determined smile. "We have both faced judgment, my lord," she replied, voice steady though soft. "I have learned that courage is not merely in surviving the whispers of society, but in standing before the one whose regard matters most, and acknowledging what cannot be silenced." He stepped closer, the space between them charged with the weight of unspoken truths and long-harbored desire. The bouquet in her hands trembled slightly, and he lifted a gloved hand to brush against the petals, as though to reassure himself of their fragility and of her presence. "Then speak plainly," he said, voice low and compelling. "Let the world fall away and let us acknowledge the truth of what binds us, beyond rumor, beyond fear, beyond the fragile veneer of propriety that has constrained us for so long." Her eyes met his, unwavering, and she let the words spill forth. "I am yours in the way that no circumstance, no gossip, no threat of reproach can alter. I am yours, my lord, in honesty, in heart, and in desire that has grown despite the warnings I once held dear." He regarded her for a long moment, every breath deliberate, every heartbeat audible in the quiet of the hall. Then, with a precision that spoke of both restraint and resolve, he took her hand, lifting it to his lips and pressing it against the steady thrum of his heart. "And I am yours wholly," he declared, voice resonant and unwavering. "No whisper of scandal, no scrutiny of the world, shall diminish the truth of what I feel, nor shall I retreat from the consequences it demands. You have spoken with courage, I shall answer with the same." Her chest swelled with a mixture of relief and exhilaration, tears pricking the corners of her eyes, yet she did not falter. "Then we shall face them together?" she asked, voice barely above a whisper, yet carrying the full weight of her resolve. "Yes," he replied, stepping closer so that the warmth of his presence enveloped her, the bouquet of wildflowers resting between them like a fragile talisman. "Together, against all whispers, all judgment, all expectation. We have weathered the storm in shadow, let us now meet it in the light, unafraid, undiminished, and unashamed." In that moment the world seemed to tilt, the silence of the manor amplified by the beating of their hearts. The storm that had raged in rumor and fear, in stolen glances and restrained touches, had reached its apex, and now the calm held attention all its own, a taut promise that what had been confessed, acknowledged, and claimed would shape the days to come. He took the bouquet from her hands, holding it between them, a symbol of fragile beauty and enduring connection. "These flowers," he said softly, "are much like you, madam. Delicate, yes, yet possessing a resilience that defies circumstance. And as they flourish despite the cold and the storm, so too shall what we share endure, nourished by honesty, by courage, and by the choice to stand together." She reached up, her fingers brushing against his coat, tracing the line of his sleeve, feeling the warmth of him beneath the fabric, the pulse of life and conviction in every measured movement. "Then let no one divide us," she whispered, "for what has been declared cannot be unspoken, and what has been claimed cannot be undone." His gaze held hers, unwavering, and he pressed a hand to the small of her back, guiding her toward the center of the room, the space between them collapsing in a measured rhythm of anticipation and acknowledgement. The wild flowers rested at their feet, petals scattering slightly in the subtle draft of the manner, as if celebrating the resolution of tension with quiet exultation. "Never," he said, voice firm and unwavering, "shall I relinquish what has been forged in honesty and in courage. If society casts stones, we shall meet them together. If whispers threaten to undo us, we shall let truth be the shield that defends us. And if life itself attempts to test us, we shall face it as one, unbroken and undivided." Tears glimmered in her eyes, not from fear but from the exhilaration of acknowledgement, the thrill of being seen and accepted not as a subject of circumstance, but as a partner in truth and desire. She pressed her hand against his chest, feeling the beat of his heart, feeling the weight and solidity of his promise, and knew that no judgment outside these walls could diminish the bond that had been so painstakingly revealed. A distant bell tolled, marking the hour, yet within the manor time seemed suspended, measured only by the heartbeat and breath of two souls fully acknowledged, fully confessed, and fully claimed. The storm outside had passed, the storm within had reached its resolution. The whispers, the scandal, the peril of society's judgment, all had been transformed into a backdrop for something far more enduring. Courage met with courage, confession met with acknowledgement, and desire met with promise. He inclined his head, brushing a stray lock of hair from her cheek, and for the first time, allowed a small, genuine smile to touch the corners of his mouth. "Then let us step into the world together," he said softly, bearing whatever consequence, yet strengthened by what has been declared and resolved between us. Her lips curved, matching his expression with the fragile triumph of one who has endured, confessed, and been received with honor and heart. "Together," she echoed, voice firm, carrying the weight of conviction and the unspoken promise that had begun with scandal, grown through confession, and now blossomed in declaration. In that quiet, gilded room, the final act of tension dissolved into an unshakable truth. They had weathered the storm, survived the whispers, and claimed a bond that neither rumor nor expectation could undo. The morning light spilled across the marble, gilding their figures in gold, and in the warmth of that illumination, they saw not the shadows of scandal but the brilliance of a love forged in courage, nurtured in honesty, and declared with the unyielding certainty of hearts aligned. And as they turned toward the doors, stepping into the world that had once threatened to define them by circumstance alone, they did so as one, undivided, unbroken, and ready to meet whatever dawn awaited beyond the walls of Wexford Manor.